So I've based a lot of my talk today on data. I've only been to the Washpool a handful of times, and I've had a read of there's a few great experts in the area, mostly from Birds SA. Graham Carpenter and Colin Ashton have given a big contribution to the knowledge of the bird life of the Washpool. But I'm going to take you through what we can learn from BirdLife Australia's Atlas of Australian Birds. And this is just a summary, a bit of a look of the contribution that the Atlas has. It was the biggest biodiversity database in Australia for many years, and has had lots of contributors, and it's actually clicked over 1 million surveys now. So when we look at what's happening in the Washpool, what do we know from those surveys and from just a few observations? So I've just taken a look at the most recent, because obviously this has been an evolving landscape and has changed, and it's now in what a lot of people would consider a degraded state from when it was a system of natural lagoons which extended further inland and got more regular freshwater inputs. So I've just taken what we know from the last 15 years, and from that time there's been 145 surveys conducted with 1,345 records of species records. And a total of 115 species have been seen, which is a fantastic tally and very diverse range of birds for such a small area. And that's what can happen in wetlands, especially ephemeral wetlands, when you've got such a variable landscape, not only in the zonation, which Tim was talking about, but also across a temporal range, so the wetting and drying phase that we've heard so much about today. And of the 115 species, 52 are water birds. 6 of those species are like the curlew sandpiper here, which has been recently listed as critically endangered, Palearctic migrants. So they come from as far away as Russia and Siberia, and they migrate down to Australia. There's one, the Latham snipe, which some of you might have come across, which is a Japanese migrant. And they have very specific habitat requirements. There are 11 species that are listed as regionally threatened, and there's also 3 nationally listed threatened species. So the Australasian bitten's been recorded here on a few occasions. Australian painted snipe, a very cryptic and dispersive species, much like Trabuki, is a nomadic opportunistic bird. So disperses way out into across the whole landscape in response to water availability, and you're just as likely to see it out in the Pilbara, and the same bird down in the Aldinga scrub, depending on water availability, just like the glossy ibis. So what is it about this landscape and these habitats which make it so useful? And it's pretty simple. For birds, you just need a available resource and necessary safety. So the resource to gain enough energy to have a successful life cycle and hopefully contribute to the next generation, and the ability to stay alive, so not get eaten or squashed or by a car, which might happen if you pop over the other side of the dune, or eaten by a dog. And when I talk about water birds, which I'm going to be talking mostly about today, and wetland birds, I'm also going to be talking, it's very important to consider wetland dependent birds. We get a little bit tied up into birds which have, which wade in the water, or they swim and have webbed feet. But it's necessary to consider these other birds that associate almost exclusively with wetlands and waterways. So things like the reed warbler and tawny little grass birds, and neophemas like the blue-winged parrot or the rock parrot, which almost exclusively feed in coastal ranges, not the blue-winged parrot, but he goes a little bit further. But a lot of neophemas only feed in salt marsh areas and associated areas. And historically, who knows, the orange-bellied parrot may have expanded its range up here. So the last thing we want to do when we think about the management of shorebirds, this is the last thing I want to see down at Aldinga Scrub. When we talk about open spaces, we want to do a little bit better than this poor old goose, this American goose. The changing face of this wetland. So if you have a look at the aerial, you can see all the zonation changes. This is while it's dry. But if you look at it across time, you can see, and you would have been, when you drive down the road, you can see how it changes, but looking at it from the air, if you're a bird flying past, you'd fly past some of these, but you'd drop into others. Fly past that in summer, fly past that, perhaps drop into that. That's when the first rains hit, then they start to recede, and all the different zonations and the different gradients of wetting and drying provide and reveal different habitats across that time frame. So it is a very temporally variable, very spatially variable, laterally, but also, as Perry pointed out, vertically. So birds are accessing different things in the water column, different things on the surface, and then those that can probe, like shorebirds, which it's particularly significant for, are accessing things below the surface, and they're probing for things like molluscs and polychaetes and worms. Whereas things like your black-winged stilts with the long legs, they're accessing things that are floating in the water column, like those ostracods and crustaceans. So, as we know, it's pretty variable. So, this is from year to year. This is what the mean rainfall is like around here. It's pretty obvious. Wet in the winter, drier in the summer. But then some years, you can get very little rain. Some years you get a lot of rain. And some of these birds, as I said, work on huge scales. So if there's locally enough rain here to fill the Washpool, but meanwhile in the Cooper system or the Lake Eyre Basin, there isn't a lot of rain, you won't get as many of those large movements of things like teal and hardhead and pink-eared duck, which all use this wetland. But when there's a flood year like this in the Cooper, there's a lot of rain in through all the way to Alice Springs. A lot of those birds are staying inland and having a bonza breeding season. So you have to use it in context. Because you're not seeing birds here at this time of year now, it might not be a reflection on the quality of the habitat. It might be happening on a far different scale. So I've just taken an average of all the surveys and just had a look at some of the species which you get here. So these species which prefer deep water, and these species here which prefer vegetated fringes, the Australian spotted crake, the black-winged stilt, which can wade a little bit further into deeper water, but will still feed all the way right through that wetting and drying period. And the sharp-tailed sandpiper, this bloke from Russia who pops down here, flies just around 11,000 kilometres for the privilege to come visit you guys. And this is just an average across the months when they are most likely to occur in the Washpool. And you can see here we've got the rainfall mean, this blue. So there's a little bit of a lag, obviously. When the water comes, it's got to be a chance for not only the wetland to fill, but for those life cycles of the diet species, the prey species, to really kick off and become useful. So the initial inundation mobilises a lot of those nutrients and displaces a lot of the terrestrial organisms that would be living in there, a lot of the terrestrial insects and invertebrates, and they'll start to die. And then these guys will come straight in. So these are the straw-necked ibises, the egrets and herons, and they'll take advantage of those dead and dying animals, and then you'll get reanimation of those sedentary aquatic organisms. Then once the invertebrates start to respond, there's a rapid generation time, and these guys are able to disperse through the wetland, and invertebrate feeders like the dabbling ducks start to come in, and the black-winged stilts, and the first waterfowl start to arrive. And then once the peak of that wetland system has occurred, the water levels, and the drying period starts, it starts to contract, revealing all these little muddy edges. And as it gets drier and drier, all of those invertebrates get concentrated further and further in, and a beautiful little smorgasbord of mudflat, or in this case, the samphire, is exposed. And these probing species, and particularly shorebirds and other wading birds like herons and egrets, will get in and feed around the edges on this amazing bloom which has been occurring. Interestingly, the sharp-tailed sandpiper, which I've been talking about a bit, can actually feed on those cyanobacterial mats, which Perry was talking about. It's got a little brushed tongue that will actually just probe right down to the base of the food chain and access these tiny little organisms. And here you can see a painted snipe, which was the endangered species I was referring to earlier, eating a larvae of, what do you reckon that is, Perry? I'll let you take it back to the lab.
So you're just going back one. So
yep.
The pink blocked out bits are corresponding
where that species, yeah. So they're feeding in the shallows and the muddy edges. So depending on the leg length, yeah, and what they're feeding on here, their diets. Other species are really, their movements are dictated by seasonal changes on a bigger scale. So here we go, this is something like the Australasian bittern, which has also been observed here, responds to drying periods in the riverina. So once we assume that they use the rice fields to breed, and then once the rice crops dry out and those wetlands dry out through New South Wales and Victorian riverina, they seek out coastal wetlands. So they almost do the opposite to the shorebirds, which come in the summer, and they come out in through the winter. So here we have the blue line is the southern occurrences of Australasian bitterns across the month, and here we have the Murray-Darling Basin occurrences of Australasian bittern. So these guys come in the winter rather than the spring. The shorebirds, like I said, from as far away as the Palearctic and Japan, they drop in at around October. September, October, and they'll stay around until March if there's enough water. There is, if you drop down to the southern end there are some nice muddy edges there, some very shallow water. Looks like some prime condition for some of these shorebirds. And they're looking for enough resources to put on up to 72% of their body weight in some cases, with some species, to make that return flight to their Palearctic breeding grounds in March and April.